We now enter that period dominated by the wee lady you see in the upper right, Victoria, Queen of England, Empress of India, and ruler of the largest empire to cover the earth. We shall look at the rise of young Victoria and her marriage to the man who would become her best friend and closest advisor, Albert. We shall then see the great stain that is on her rule, that is, the great Irish famine, followed by the great revolutions that sprung up in 1848, and then finally the political foreign policy known as realpolitik. Her full name was Alexandrina Victoria, and she would become the first female monarch since Elizabeth I. She dropped the first name and simply went by Victoria throughout her life and throughout her reign. She was the granddaughter of George III and the daughter of his fourth son, Edward, the Duke of Kent, who died when she was just a baby. Her mother and King William IV got along very badly. Her mother was very proper, and she thought that King William IV, with all of his illegitimate children, was an oversexed oaf. Victoria, on the other hand, found William IV to be a very kind old man. And Victoria often thought that her mother was too domineering and too controlling. She would become the longest ruling British monarch, 63 years, but then she was passed by Elizabeth II in 2017. She would come to be known as the grandmother of all Europe because her grandchildren sat on various thrones throughout Europe, most notably Britain, Germany, and Russia, as well as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Spain. One problem that Victoria had when she assumed the throne at age 18 was that she had to live with her mother until she was married. Although she definitely wanted her mother out of Buckingham Palace, she took her time and allowed people to bring her a number of suitors from various royal families. She was eventually smitten with her first cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, a small German principality near Belgium. While Albert regarded Victoria affectionately at first, he was not quite smitten, but he did accept the Queen's proposal and became Prince Consort of the Queen. At first, Albert was largely kept away from getting involved in the political decisions that went along with the crown, but over time, he became Victoria's closest advisor. The Duke of Wellington particularly trusted Albert, and that was enough for the Queen because the Queen absolutely relied on the Duke of Wellington. Eventually, Albert and Victoria's desks would be side by side in the Queen's office. Albert was not popular at first because he was German, and Parliament would not grant him a peerage in the House of Lords. He could care less about that. Albert did introduce many traditional German customs to Britain, especially that of the Christmas tree. So when you see the Christmas tree in your homes, remember that is a German custom, and it was something that was introduced to England and therefore to the United States by Albert. Now, unlike many husbands who had numerous mistresses and had very little contact with his wife outside the bedroom and largely ignored his children, Albert became a model of family stability and attentive fatherhood to the 9 children that Victoria produced. Victoria didn't like children. She found them to be ugly and misbehaved. Albert, on the other hand, absolutely doted on the children. And so, because Albert doted on the children, Victoria doted on the children. And all 9 of their children survived to adulthood, which was a very rare occurrence. Albert, being excluded from politics, decided that he was going to take up social causes. So he became an ardent abolitionist, advocating for the end of the slave trade. He wanted better wages for workers. He wanted an end to child labor. He became a leading proponent of the arts, science, and education. And his greatest triumph was the Exposition of 1851, in which Britain built this great, huge crystal palace, which was a World's Fair, and all the greatest ideas of machinery and industrialization would be there. And Albert said that this is the way that the education of the world can increase, by bringing all these ideas together. He also purchased for his wife and family a castle in Scotland called Balmoral, and that remains in the possession of the royal family today. It is not, like Buckingham Palace, a possession of the British government. It is instead the private possession of the royal family. Albert worked very, very hard with his kids, and worked very, very hard with his wife, and worked perhaps too hard. In 1861, he died of typhoid fever, and it may have been exacerbated by Crohn's disease. Victoria was absolutely shattered by this and went into a long period of mourning and would not wear anything other than black the rest of her life. Here you see Victoria around age 14, and in the lower right, Victoria at her coronation. When she became queen, this ended the union of England with Hanover, because the Principality of Hanover did not allow for women to take the throne. And so her uncle, Ernst Augustus, who was the youngest son of King George III, became the King of Hanover, and Victoria became the Queen of Great Britain, because Hanover operated under what was called Salic law, and Salic law meant that only men could inherit the throne. As you can tell by looking at Victoria, she was not the most attractive person on the face of the earth. This is not to say that she was ugly in any way. She was very plain. And yet it's those plain looks that really started to endear her at first to the English people. She seemed to be one of them in looks. On the left is young Albert, who was born the same year as Victoria. He was actually a few months younger than she was. They were first cousins. He was the younger son of the Prince of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, the small little German state near Belgium. And eventually that house would rule Belgium. He was German. Victoria comes from the House of Hanover. She's German. The British royal family, folks, are more German than they are British. This is Albert around 1845, and you can see that he was very professional and kept himself very professionally, and was sort of a no-nonsense type of guy in public, but a very loving, doting man with his family. Here you see Victoria and Albert together. Victoria was the queen, and in government and politics, she was always at the forefront. Albert was very careful to always stand and walk behind her. But in private, Albert was the one on whom Victoria relied heavily for advice. The stain that marks the reign of Victoria and showed the full callousness of the British Parliament and government, especially the anti-Irish and anti-Catholic element that still existed, came forth in one of the worst human disasters in all history. Just like Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, it was not a natural disaster, but a man-made catastrophe. The Great Hunger, or what the Irish call An Gcóir Mór, came about because of obtuse adherence to ideology, callous indifference, and outright attempts to ethnically cleanse an entire nation. Why did the Irish famine occur? Ireland's pre-hunger population. In 1744, Ireland had 2.4 million people in it. In 1801, it had 5.4 million people in it. In 1841, it had 8.5 million people in it on the eve of the hunger. The Irish dependency on the potato is one of the first reasons. The Irish grew 15 million tons of potatoes. Adult males consume 14 pounds of potatoes per day. Women 10 to 12 pounds. Children aged 10 and older, between 10 and 12 pounds. Children under 10, 5 to 10 pounds daily. 40% of the population relied on the potato for the main source of nourishment. The percentage was much higher in the west of Ireland. The potato is a good source of nutrition and vitamins. It prevented disease. It could be grown on very poor quality land. As a result, because of their dependency on the potato, the Irish as a whole were healthier than their European counterparts and resisted many of the diseases that swept through the continent. The other problem for the Irish is that they had very low living standards. They lived in mud dwellings, were the most common form of habitat for them. The houses were grouped into four categories: fourth class, third class, second class, first class. Usually a fourth class was one room in a mud cabin, and then you moved up from there. 40% of the population lived in fourth class dwellings. 40% inhabited third class dwellings. The percentage of fourth class housing was much higher in the West, sometimes as high as 80%. In addition, the Irish had to deal with sectarian prejudice and the insecurity of land tenure. They did not own the land. It had been taken from them during the Elizabethan and then Cromwellian wars. There was a strong anti-Catholic sentiment in Ireland among the Anglo-Irish, that is, those of the Duke of Wellington, the English who were born in Ireland, looked down their noses at the Irish. The Irish potato crop was destroyed by a fungus that had come over from Russia called late blight. It essentially reduced the potato crop in the potato patches that the Irish grew their potatoes in to a black, smelly soup and rendered the potato totally inedible. This created massive starvation and reduced the island to 2 million people. In 1845, 40% of the potato crop was lost to the blight. In 1846, the blight destroyed over 90% of the crop. It was worse in 1847, known as Black 47. By this point, potato seed was very scarce and expensive. Less than 100,000 hectares were planted. This actually reduces the blight effect because there weren't as many potatoes to infect, so to speak. Hunger and disease took a very hard toll. In 1848, the blight struck yet again, and again nearly the entire crop was destroyed. Between 1848 and 1852, the blight struck intermittently. In 1844, for instance, the Irish grew 15 million tons of potatoes. In 1848, they grew only 500,000 pounds of potatoes. The effects of the hunger were disastrous. People scavenged the countryside for food. They ate nettles, dandelions, roots and berries. They even ate cats and dogs, anything that they could put their hands on. The workers at one particular English landlord's estate went to him on hands and knees to allow them to hunt the game on his land, and he said yes. With starvation comes disease. 85% of the deaths during the hunger came because of disease. Bacteria like typhus, dysentery, cholera, viruses like the measles, tuberculosis, edema. And the worst part of the whole thing is that there was food still in Ireland. Plenty of food. But the human carnage continued as barns were filled with grains waiting to be exported. Because of the corn laws, the Irish could not eat the wheat, the barley, the oats that were in those barns. It was mandated by law to be exported. People began to attack convoys transporting food, and so the government sent British troops to protect the grain from starving people. They wrote, "Government will not interfere with the regular operations of merchants for the supply of food to the country." Evictions take place. Over 500,000 people were evicted from their homes during the hunger. No relief, no granting of a stay of eviction. This is laissez-faire economics. People said this is what God intended. This is probably due to some fault of the Irish people. Many said it was unethical to help the Irish. It would make them lazier and more dependent upon government. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Some governmental officials came up with work relief schemes. They put pay linked to individual exertion. They had some of the Irish build roads called famine roads that started nowhere and ended nowhere and served no use whatsoever because government was not supposed to do anything in that way to be effective. They phased out relief works. The government did put together some soup kitchens. There was, of course, the workhouses. We know the horrible conditions of the workhouses. Families were split up. Children 2 years old and older were often taken from their parents. The work was hard, it was brutal, often meaningless. More disease takes place in the workhouses. There was a high death rate. Many people went to the workhouse as a last resort. There was private charity, too. The Calcutta Committee raised several $100,000 to send to Ireland. The Quakers. You know why you eat Quaker oats today? Because the Quakers developed the method of producing oats and then creaming them so that they could serve it to the Irish. The British Relief Organization went over to help. The Sultan of Turkey gave the equivalent of $100,000. The International Catholic Community in the United States sent over money. The Choctaw Indian Nation sent over $750, which to them was a large fortune. Why? Because on the Trail of Tears, when the Choctaw Indians were sent to Oklahoma and other places west, many of the soldiers that escorted them were Irish soldiers, and they were very kind to the Indians. The Indians remembered this, and so they sent money back to Ireland. Queen Victoria gave £2,000 herself. She was not unaware of what was going on. But most of the aid that was sent ran out by the middle of 1847, and the blight still had 5 more years to run. The long-term effects still open to debate. The deaths are continually revised upwards. The Irish language disappears for a time, but Irish nationalism grows as people turned and said, Britain is no longer for us. We are no longer for Britain. We want Irish independence. And of course, finally, last but not least, emigration. People left for Ireland. They left for the ports of America and other places as well. South America also. The cities of Boston, New York, Charleston, South Carolina, Baltimore, Maryland, Philadelphia, New Orleans, now saw this tremendous flood of Irish immigrants coming in. How did they come? They didn't come on luxurious passenger liners. They came on cotton ships. The ships that brought the cotton to the cities of England for the textile mills now went back with Irish in its steerage compartments. Oftentimes these ships became places of disease and death, and they were often called coffin ships. This map of Ireland shows how Catholics had become deprived of their lands from the time of Cromwell until the time of the Hunger. Shows exactly the Catholic ownership of the lands. By the way, I'm not here to promote Catholicism over Protestantism or anything like that. Simply pointing out a very basic fact here. The Corn Laws, which we had mentioned earlier with Sir Robert Peel, and the stubborn adherence to laissez-faire economics were the reasons why the Irish could not eat the very produce of their lands. It is not a famine. Many people simply call it the potato famine. It is not a famine. A famine means there's no food. There was plenty of food. This was an enforced starvation. This shows the increase and then the resultant decline of the population of Ireland from before the hunger to the time after the hunger. A perfect example of the callousness of the British toward the Irish is this man right here, Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan. He was the colonial administrator in Ireland. During the height of the hunger, Trevelyan was slow to give out direct government food and monetary aid to the Irish due to his very strong belief in laissez-faire economics and the free hand of the market. He also wrote highly disparaging remarks about the Irish in a letter to an Irish peer stating, "The judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson." This shows the number of emigrants from Ireland to countries overseas, like the United States, Australia, Canada, and other nations. This chart shows the number of immigrants coming from Ireland to the United States in the 1840s and 50s during the height of the hunger. This has a tremendous effect on the United States itself, as there was a strong anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic faction within the United States called the Know Nothing movement. They called themselves the American Party. They said America first for Americans, not realizing that, of course, all Americans are themselves immigrants. This picture right here exhibits the epitome of the insanity that surrounded the hunger. This is what you call a famine road. It was constructed by workers for the government. Because of the stubborn adherence to the ideology that government is not actually supposed to create public works that actually work, the famine roads began and ended nowhere and served no useful function.
Through the bullets and the sparks, always with the smart remark, your eyes blazing blue. When we need a confidence, we always turn to you. When they shot our leader.
The Great Hunger also gave rise to the Young Ireland movement. Once again, the idea that Ireland should be its own nation, independent from Britain, was highlighted tremendously by what was going on during the hunger. Young Ireland disagreed with O'Connell, who represented Old Ireland, and his attempts to compromise with Britain. Young Ireland promoted the Irish language and attempted a rebellion in 1848 called the Famine Rebellion. These 7 men, top row from left to right, Thomas Davis, he was a cultural nationalist who wanted to unite the Irish based not on religion but on language. He was a Protestant and died early at scarlet fever. Second from the right, John Mitchell. He was arrested and deported to Bermuda and then Tasmania. He escaped to the United States, helped create the University of Tennessee. Then he joins the South during the Civil War and advocated for slavery. He lost his youngest son at the Battle of Gettysburg. His grandson would become mayor of New York City. On the far right at the top is Charles Gavin Duffy. He escaped conviction, but later emigrated to Australia, where he became its 8th Prime Minister. His children also went high in Irish and Australian politics. Bottom row left to right, Michael Doheny. He eluded arrest and escaped to New York, where he became a lawyer. Second from the left is Thomas Francis Meagher. It looks like meager when you spell it, but it's pronounced Meagher. He was sentenced to life in Tasmania, but he escaped, got to the United States. He then helped form the 69th New York Irish Brigade during the Civil War. He's in the tradition of the wild geese. He became governor of Montana, and then he died suspiciously in a riverboat accident in 1867. Second from the right is Terence Bello McManus. He got life in Tasmania also, and then escaped to the United States. His quote in court was famous. "I therefore say it is not because I loved England less, but because I loved Ireland more that I now stand before you." And finally, Patrick O'Donoghue, again transported to Tasmania, rallied his fellow convicts there, then escaped to the United States and became active in U.S. politics. The Young Irelander movement was part of the Great Surge of 1848, which was called the Spring of Nations, because revolutions seemed to break out all over the world. Major revolutions broke out in Europe caused by a general economic crisis. In January, Italian revolutionaries established the Roman Republic before it was put down by the Bourbon Kingdom of Sicily. The kingdom had been uncorked. 12 years later, the Sorgimento united all of Italy. In February, France went into revolution, and King Louis Philippe was overthrown, ending the House of Orleans' rule over France. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the emperor, now becomes second of the president of the Second Republic. The revolutionaries in Germany were called the 48ers. They demanded political reform. They were from the middle class. They were from the student groups. Many of them were forced into exile. One of them was a man named Karl Schurz, who went to the United States, got elected to the United States Senate. He became one of the great reformers of the Republican Party. In Austria, Hungary revolted along with numerous Slavic peoples. The revolt among its various nationalities led Metternich to resign. This paved the way for Franz Joseph I to take the throne, and thus began one of the saddest reigns in all the history of monarchy. In Scandinavia, Denmark and Sweden go into revolution, and farmers and liberals help create a constitutional monarchy in Denmark, abolish slavery in the Danish colonies. A Swedish uprising was suppressed, but it was only suppressed after the king allowed more constitutional. The Poles, who had lost their country, remember during the dissolution of Poland, now begin to revolt again against Prussia, the Germans that were on their land. The Swiss rewrite their constitution and become a stronger federal republic after what is called the Sonderbund War, in which several of the cantons in Switzerland revolt to try and create a more federated, centralized republic. Outside of Europe, the flames of revolution are catching fire over there. Liberia, the country of Liberia, was established for former slaves in Africa. It is one of two independent African nations at the time. The other was Ethiopia, which was a kingdom. In Colombia, there was a 20-year civil war that included Panama and parts of Central America as well as Colombia. Chile had a liberal uprising by Jose Maria de la Cruz. Brazil had what was known as the Beach Rebellion. Mexico engaged in liberal reform after they lost to the United States in 1848 in the Mexican War, and even the United States felt a few sparks from this revolution. We didn't have a big revolution at the time. Instead, we had a collapse of the second party system. The old Whig Party begins to fall apart. The Democratic Party is going through massive changes after the Mexican War because of the dispensation of the territories that we won over from Mexico. Would they be slave or would they be free? We came very close to a civil war, but we avoided it. It's a compromise of 1850. You will recall that politicians like Cardinal Richelieu, who we studied earlier, followed the policy of raison d'etat when dealing with foreign policy. Then you also had Metternich, who followed a needs-based foreign policy. Now, what was following in that wake throughout the world when it came to politics was a diplomacy that was based primarily on considerations of given circumstances and factors, rather than ideological notions or moral or ethical premises. The term coined by Ludwig von Rothschild is called Realpolitik. Realpolitik is the politics of tough-minded realism, aimed at strengthening the state and tightening the social order. And while Realpolitik was begun in Germany, the first chief practitioner of this policy, the man in the corner right there, Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, better known as Napoleon III. He is the last monarch to rule over France. He took the name Napoleon III to honor his first cousin, Napoleon Francois Joseph Charles Bonaparte, who was the son of the emperor. He died of tuberculosis at the age of 21 in Austria. Since young Louis Napoleon spent much of his childhood in exile in Switzerland and Bavaria, he spoke French with a slight German accent. This made him a target of critics and people making fun of him from time to time. He went down to Italy with his older brother and got involved with the Carbonari, and there his older brother died. Twice he tried to start a coup in France to restore the Bonapartes to power. He failed both times. The first time he fled into exile, the second time he was imprisoned, but then he escaped prison and went to Britain. He then returned after his arch enemy, King Louis Philippe, had abdicated his throne, and immediately got involved in politics. He was elected to the National Assembly. He was then elected President of France and began to amass more and more power, which most Frenchmen said was a good thing. After 3 years, the President Napoleon then staged a coup against himself and had himself named emperor. This was opposed by very few people, but one very notable opponent was a fellow by the name of Victor Hugo. You might have known him from the Defense of Notre Dame and Les Miserables. Hugo would oppose Napoleon III, label him a traitor, and have to live 20 years in exile, waiting for Napoleon to his end of his reign. Napoleon then turned around and had the people go to the polls and say, did you like this coup or not? And it was overwhelmingly yes, which led many to believe that the vote was rigged. Napoleon III then, with power now consolidated in him, reasserts the grandeur of France. He revived the cult of his uncle, who had been brought back, the corpse of whom had been brought back from St. Helena and put into that beautiful sarcophagus. He contributed to the end of the concert of Europe. He combined economic liberalism and nationalism with a very authoritarian style of rule. See, he's trying to be just like his uncle was, very personally conservative, but politically and economically liberal. He was politically old-fashioned, but he advanced modern economic ideas. He created innovative investment banks. He worked out the first free trade agreement between England and France, beginning the process of warming relations between those two old enemies. He began a massive building program to make Paris the gem of the world. He had the first ever department store constructed. It was called the Bon Marché. Paris looks beautiful today because of his work. And of course, there are plenty of trees along the Champs-Élysées. And the joke, of course, is that there are plenty of trees on the Champs-Élysées so that the Germans can run to the show. He tried desperately to find new political allies by liberalizing the politics, at least on the surface. Remember that the Congress of Vienna had specifically been designed to roll back the gains that the Emperor Napoleon had made back in the early 1800s. Napoleon III wanted to roll back the Congress of Vienna. Metternich had retired and then died in 1852. And so Napoleon tries to realign continental politics to benefit France. He wanted international glory for France. Hence, he took advantage of the American Civil War. He sent troops to Mexico, and see if you can follow me here. He sends French troops to Mexico to install Maximilian, the younger brother of the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph, as Emperor of Mexico. 5 years later, those French troops would be defeated on, you guessed it, May the 5th, Cinco de Mayo. Napoleon III also sent troops to a place called Vietnam to colonize that part of the world. Napoleon then begins to intervene in the quarrel between the Russians and the Ottomans. He attempted very hard to pry Austria away from Russia. Austria and Russia were long-time allies. Napoleon wants to pull the Austrians away from the Russians. And Napoleon sees the growing power of Prussia, the German state, the center of Europe. He begins to realize that that is going to be his worry. So this map shows the spring of nations and the places where rebellions broke out. You see that it's mostly in the center of Europe, although in other places as well. By and large, most of these rebellions were put down. They failed. However, the monarchies themselves that put down these rebellions begin to liberalize and use many of the goals of the revolutionaries to cement their rule and to make their rule more liberal in these countries.